So I think it's important to understand that the standards are part of what public education is driven by right now. I think on some levels they're important for basic literacy skills. Students need to be able to read and write well by the time they graduate high school. They also need basic kind of logic, deductive abilities that is sometimes measured by the math standards and tests. I think for history, it's more complicated because the history test I feel is very subjective. There's more standards, more content than can be covered in the scope of a one-year history class, and so it becomes really hard to test. And I think a lot of times the students that do well on the history standards test aren't necessarily great at history, they're just good test takers. And so if they've come from a strong literary background, they've been read to a lot, they have kind of access to just a lot of the written word throughout their life, they're going to do well on those tests. And it becomes something that if it starts to drive history teaching into just kind of rote memorization and cramming information that teachers think will be on the tests, not only, I don't think that's an effective way to prepare for the test because it's not really going to help, but it just kind of shortchanges the importance of the subject. So with that said, I think you can do really meaningful teaching connected to the standards. The standards are comprehensive enough, at least for California, that they cover pretty much any aspect of modern world history. So you can find a connection to teaching anything you want related to the standards. I know there are certain power standards that are covered more often on the test, but even that, I mean, you can connect to the themes and kind of major ideas. And then I think if you just don't get caught up in like the drill and kill and just trying to cram for a content test and really go into deep exploration around fewer of the standards, that students walk away with a better understanding of both the standard and then also just a stronger connection to why they were learning what they were learning, and it becomes more meaningful to them.
Do you think there's any bias in the actual content of the way the standards are written or the subjects that they cover?
Yeah, it's pretty Eurocentric. We've done an activity with students before where they go through the world history standards and try and figure out what parts of the world are represented, and I think they realize that in doing that, the majority of world history, modern world history in the standards and in most textbooks is kind of about European interests and the impact that they've had on places around the world, and so it's less about, at least in 10th grade in high school, it's less about other civilizations and societies and other ways of kind of interpreting the world. So it is very much through a European lens.
Okay. Do you believe there's a literacy problem at your school?
Yeah, I don't think it's specific to our school.
Well, literacy problem in education in general, and at your school in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably skill-wise the most important thing that I can teach, right, is help students become stronger in literacy. A lot of different things I think that, it's an area where I think teachers can do a much better job, right, especially history teachers who don't always think of themselves as literacy teachers, but should. So yeah, and I think the more public education and testing culture goes to drive kind of multiple choice tests and that type of thing, it does take away a bit from really meaningful writing and kind of critical reading abilities too. So I think that's, and just popular culture in general, right? We're a texting and email, Facebook communicating society now, and so I think that will eventually have an impact on our ability to write coherently, informally. So yeah, definitely a problem. Definitely not something that is insurmountable that we can't address with the right attention.
In terms of like your definition of what the literacy problem is, specifically for this site, what are some trends that you might see among your students?
Well, students come in, I would say maybe not the majority, but a good number of students come in below reading level. Some, specifically students with IEPs, come in like really far below reading level, and so it's trying to provide just to differentiate, right? So you have to meet students who have read 1,000 books by the time they've come to ninth grade, and students who've never read one book by the time even they've finished 10th grade. So I think that's kind of the biggest problem, is just the huge range in abilities and skills. And then giving students the proper material. So I'm not going to ask a student I shouldn't ask a student at a 3rd grade reading level to read a college text, or if I do, I need to provide them with ways to kind of manage that text, or to chunk it and to make it more kind of digestible for them. But the problem with that is just time, right? So it's adapting lots of different resources for one lesson, which I don't usually have the time to do. Ideally, I would have 4 levels of reading or at least 2 different levels of reading for one assignment. I rarely have the ability to do that.
What do you think about the idea of literacy, not just like in terms of reading and writing, but as a way of interpreting, students' lived experiences? And what do you think of your students' ability to understand that concept and use that concept?
How do you mean, like being literate of their
social trends and like the way things are, and like in terms of like being literate of like social injustice or social justice issues in their communities and in their school?
Yeah, and I think they're pretty savvy, and I think that's something that I was saying earlier, right? That there's all sorts of different intelligence and knowledge and things that our students are really strong in, and their understanding of lived experience in the world, their immediate world is pretty good. I think living in San Francisco too, they have kind of exposure to a lot of different ethnicities and perspectives and people. Might not necessarily be in their families or neighborhoods, but at the school anyway, there's kind of a big pool of diversity, both socioeconomically and racially, culturally, and it gives students the ability to kind of learn from each other in a really meaningful social way. I think it's important that we use those strengths and understandings to help improve their kind of formal, traditional literary abilities, right? Because those are things that they're going to need pretty much in any job or anything they want to do beyond it. And so the hook or the connection or the strength is the social awareness and literacy. As teachers, we need to bridge that to helping them become better at kind of the more traditional forms of literacy.
Do you use textbooks at all?
Not really. I'll use excerpts of things. It's really just pulling together readings often, so going to a lot of different places. If there's one thing I use the most, is probably TCI, or History Alive, which is curriculum, kind of more collaborative based, student-centered curriculum, as opposed to using just a history textbook.
All right, thanks. That's